Tonight, we walk the echoing halls, where candles burn low and footsteps vanish into stone. A hush lives here, as if the walls themselves remember what no record dares to keep. In this quiet, a blade glints, clean, unseen, and sworn to holy shadow. The doors are already open. You enter, and the air tastes of incense and iron. A bell tolls somewhere out of sight. Not for prayer, at least not for yours. In these corridors, power is not spoken. It is carried, sealed, and enforced. This is a book about the hands behind the ring, not the popes you know from paintings, not the councils, not the marble and Latin. It is about the quiet ones who kept order when words failed. Men who could pass a guard, pass a gate, pass a doubt. Men who were told, go, and did not return until the problem no longer breathed. You will hear of nights when the church faced kings and heresies it could not scold into silence. Of ledgers with names that never made it to the archives. Of cloaked brothers who prayed before they moved and then moved like prayer. You will learn their signs, their oaths, their codes. The ways a rosary can count more than sins. The ways a letter can mean more than words. The way a chalice can hold wine or warning. We are not hunting scandal. We are reading a map drawn in absence. Where a witness should be, there is none. Where a record should stand, a page has been lifted clean. Still, patterns remain. Footprints hide, but dust remembers. This is the path we follow, traces of a force that served both faith and fear. If what you seek is shouting, you will not find it here. These stories walk on soft feet, yet they cut, because faith can bless, and faith can bind, and under a certain seal, faith can kill. Come, keep your voice low, place a hand on the wall, feel the stone hum with secrets. We begin where the candles do not flicker. The Pope's ring caught candlelight in ways a crown could never match, gold dulled by centuries of wear, yet still alive in its gleam. It was more than jewelry, it was permission, and it was command. When lips touched that ring, they did not honour a man. They bound themselves to the weight of his silence. The seal that pressed wax upon parchment carried more than a message. It carried the certainty that what was written could unmake kings. In those years, the church stretched farther than its towers. Its power reached into courts, into markets, into bedrooms of princes. But parchment alone could not hold it. Authority does not move by ink alone. It requires hands, hands that can enter when doors close, hands that can carry a message past a crowd without ever being noticed. The ring and the seal were the surface, the glow. Beneath them, a current moved. A current made of men whose faces blurred into crowds, and whose names seldom appeared again once spoken. The ring was kissed, the seal was broken, but the meaning lay in motion. A letter read aloud in daylight said one thing. The same letter, carried at night and whispered into the ear of a chosen brother, meant something else entirely. To obey the letter was one matter. To obey the silence it implied was another, and it was the silence that mattered most. Each pope, whether fierce or frail, relied on this rhythm. When an enemy sharpened words too keenly, the seal appeared on his desk in the morning, stamped with ornate calm. Yet by nightfall, that enemy's tongue had grown quieter, not by debate, but by absence. When a city threatened rebellion, the ring pressed wax upon an order of indulgence, a call for forgiveness, a promise of grace. But beneath that, forgiveness ran the shadow three men in cloaks, passing unnoticed, who ensured forgiveness was the only path left to the city. To wear the ring was to command more than prayers. It was to move lives like pieces across a board, some pieces shining with crowns, others vanishing when their role was done. The seal recorded the visible order. The invisible one needed no ink. The first men to bear this burden did so with trembling. They prayed for forgiveness even as they learned to strike, but with time, trembling gave way to routine. The ring remained the symbol of sanctity, the seal the mark of authority, but the quiet steps of the chosen brothers ensured both symbols endured. Every pope understood this truth. Without hands in shadow, no throne in light remains steady. Faith preached from pulpits might bend hearts, but it was the silent obedience of the unseen that guarded the church's survival. The ring could be kissed, the seal admired, but power lived in silence, and silence had its price. Every act began the same way. A single candle lit in a room too small to echo, wax dripping onto stone, flame flickering against a face, bowed not in guilt but in steadiness. Before a hand touched steel, it touched prayer. The brothers who bore these tasks were not free men. They were bound, not by chains, but by words spoken once in a darkened chapel. The vow was simple, to obey without question. Yet within that vow lived its own torment, for obedience does not erase the soul's knowing, it only buries it beneath ritual, and ritual became their balm. The candle was not for light, it was for focus. As wax softened and flame steadied, so too did their breath. They whispered psalms, not aloud but inside themselves, like stones dropping one by one into still water. Each word was a measure, each pause a clearing. They prayed not for forgiveness, for they believed their task already sanctified, but for clarity, to see the path without hesitation. Steel came after, a knife honed until it caught no glint, polished not for beauty but for absence. It would not shine in torchlight, it would not betray itself on a silvered surface. Some brothers carried cords instead, soft as wool, yet capable of binding life itself. Others bore powders from apothecaries who knew never to ask. Each tool was chosen with precision, but none was touched until the prayer was done. The order was not written in any catechism. It was passed through eyes, nods, and repetition. Candle first, then steel. In this rhythm lay control. Without it, steel grew heavy with fear. With it, steel moved as lightly as air. Those who trained new brothers taught this above all. You cannot strike until you are still, they would say, and you cannot be still until you burn the candle. It was not superstition, it was survival. Men who acted in haste were caught. Men who let trembling hands speak were noticed. Only those who mastered silence inside themselves could pass unseen through the world outside. In time, the ritual became more than preparation. It became identity. A brother could walk through any city, see a single flame in a window at dusk, and know, not a word needed. The candle said all. One of us is near, and he is steady. Steel never gleamed in these halls. It never hung on walls as decoration. It rested in shadows, waiting for the moment the flame died out. And when the flame was pinched, when the wax cooled, when the air filled with the faint scent of smoke, the hand rose. The prayer was complete. The steel was ready. It was never written. Not in canon law, not in papal bulls, not even in the secret margins of ledgers. Yet every brother knew it. Silence was the first and final rule. Not silence of lips alone, that was simple enough. The silence that mattered was deeper. A silence of the face, of the body, of the soul itself. To be a brother of shadow meant to walk through a crowd as though one were smoke seen perhaps but never noticed. Training began not with weapons but with stillness. For days at a time, a novice would sit in a cloister corner, hands folded, eyes lowered. He was instructed to watch the world without being part of it. To notice the way a robe brushed stone, the way a sparrow shifted on a sill, the way a merchant's voice cracked when he lied. He was taught that silence was not emptiness but attention. To hold his own words back was to hear the words of others more clearly. The silence extended into action. No brother moved without cause. No hand twitched. No eye flicked. No breath drew sharp unless necessary. A pause could mean life. To wait, to let another pass by without ever knowing, was as much a strike as steel itself. Silence guarded them more than walls. Among themselves, the brothers had signs. A cough placed in the wrong moment was not accident but warning. A bead dropped from a rosary in the midst of prayer was a message as clear as speech. But they never named these signs. They never taught them aloud. Each was learned by watching, by surviving. Confession was its own silence. No priest ever received the full truth. Words circled, hinted, but never pierced the heart of what was done. Even in the shadow of forgiveness, silence endured. The hardest silence was not outward, but inward. A man who carried tasks for the ring and seal often carried weight in his heart. Yet to speak of it, even in whispers to himself, was forbidden. The vow demanded stillness, even in thought. Many brothers broke here, their silence cracking under the press of conscience. Those who endured became harder, not crueler, but emptied. Like stone worn smooth by centuries of water, they became surfaces upon which nothing clung. In courts, they were ghosts. In markets, they were beggars. In churches, they were pilgrims. They spoke when they had to, smiled when expected, prayed when seen. But in truth, they were always silent, and silence is the greatest disguise. The rule was never rewarded, never praised. A brother who lived by it simply survived. A brother who broke it did not. Thus silence became more than discipline. It became life itself. The church never wrote of these men, but it remembered them in other ways, in victories that seemed to come without battle, in heresies that fell without debate, in kings who softened without reason. Silence was the reason. Silence was the blade that never gleamed. And in that silence, the church endured. It began in a chapel where the air always seemed colder than the stone around it. A small room, never named in any plan, always tucked between larger walls, always hidden behind doors that groaned softly but never echoed. Here, a candle was lit not for prayer alone, but for binding. The men who entered knelt in shadow, not before saints or altars, but before the silence itself. The oath was not long. It was never read from scrolls or inked on vellum. Words spoken aloud could one day be overheard. Instead, the oath was memorized, passed from the lips of one brother to the ears of another, shaped by the rhythm of breath rather than parchment. A simple vow, to serve the will of the church beyond the reach of its light. The ceremony was plain, yet its weight could bend a man's future until it broke. A brother swore not to question the order that came to him, not to weigh it against his own conscience, not to test it against law or reason. He swore to move as an extension of the ring and the seal, to strike when told, to wait when told, to vanish when told. There was no promise of reward, no guarantee of absolution. The only certainty was service. Those who guided the oath often spoke a final reminder. The seal binds the hand, but the oath binds the soul. For without that bond, steel could waver. Without it, hesitation could ruin more than the brother. It could expose what was never meant to be seen. The men who took the oath entered as novices, men shaped by faith but uncertain of the weight they would carry. They left changed, though nothing on their faces revealed it. A subtle stillness clung to them. They no longer moved with the casual rhythm of other men. Their steps became deliberate, their eyes sharper, their voices fewer. The first days after the oath were tests. A novice might be ordered to follow a merchant through crowded streets, not to harm, not to speak, simply to vanish into the man's shadow until told otherwise. Another might be sent to deliver a letter to a priest, but the letter was blank. The task was not delivery. It was silence, never to ask why, never to doubt, only to carry. Failure meant dismissal, not openly, never with shame. A novice who broke silence or asked too much was simply sent away one evening, told to serve the church in prayer, not in shadow. Few resisted. They left quietly, relieved to carry lighter burdens. Those who remained were those who carried silence well, men who could watch without being noticed, who could breathe without drawing attention, who could exist without leaving traces. In the oath, there was no mention of loyalty to pope or priest. The wording reached higher, or perhaps lower. It was loyalty to the church itself, to the idea that stood larger than any man who wore the tiara. If one pope died and another rose, the oath remained unbroken. If kings changed, if borders shifted, the oath remained. It was to something larger, something that had no face and never spoke. Years later, when some brothers grew old and their hands stiffened, they still remembered the night they knelt in that cold chapel. They recalled the flame that burned not to warm but to bind. And many confessed, if only in thought, that it was the most honest moment of their lives. For in that instant they gave up choice. And in giving up choice, they gained the stillness to act without fear. The oath did not grant power, it stripped it away. What remained was service, and from that service shadows moved as if on command of stone itself. The records of the church were vast parchments lined with neat ink, archives filled with bulls, decrees, letters, indulgences. Yet among these volumes, one will not find the names of the brothers. Their lives were erased not by fire or accident, but by design. From the moment a man took the oath, his name began to fade. At first, it lingered in ledgers of baptism, in town rolls, in memory of kin. But within the church's walls, his name grew softer, spoken less often, replaced by signs, nods, gestures. He became the one with the scar, or the one who walks with a limp, or simply brother. To carry no name was to carry no trace. The practice was practical. A name could be overheard, repeated, traced back. Better that there be none to speak. But it was also spiritual in its way. To lose a name was to shed the self, to become part of something wider, like a drop dissolving into water. Families sometimes asked what became of their sons. A mother might send a letter to Rome, asking after the boy who had entered service. A clerk would respond politely, noting that the church held him in her prayers. Nothing more. And over time, the questions slowed, then ceased. The man was still alive, perhaps still breathing, but to the world he was gone. Among the brothers themselves, the absence of names built a strange bond. They recognized each other by silence, by habit, by the tilt of a head or the way one reached for a candle. To speak a name would have been almost obscene, like breaking a fast before its time. They belonged not to themselves, but to the vow. On rare occasions, a brother was caught in the act, questioned by guards, held by nobles, pressed by strangers. When asked his name, he would give none. Not out of defiance, but out of truth, his name no longer mattered. Often, his silence unnerved his captors more than words would have. For a man without a name cannot be bargained with, cannot be threatened with disgrace, cannot be tied to lineage. He is nothing, and nothing is harder to hold. The church recorded their deeds obliquely. The heresy was resolved. The matter has been quieted. The rebellion did not take root. Never was a hand credited, never a brother named. Their shadows stretched across kingdoms, yet their traces vanished at the threshold of archives. It is easy to believe that such men might feel loss, yet many grew used to it. To walk without name was to walk without burden. They passed through cities like dust in sunlight seen, perhaps, but unnoticed. When they prayed not as men but as vessels. When they struck not as selves but as silence given form. Death sealed the erasure. A brother who fell in service was buried without inscription. Sometimes in a churchyard, sometimes in soil far from Rome, sometimes in rivers where stone remembered better than men. No marker bore his title. No scroll recorded his passing. Only the church knew, and even she did not write it down. To have no name is a terrible freedom. It erases honour and disgrace alike. But it is also a shield, for in anonymity lies survival, not for the man, but for the power he serves. The brothers understood this, and so their faces blurred into crowds, and their names dissolved into silence, until only the oath remained. Every city has doors that lock, doors that guard, doors that bar the unwanted. But the brothers knew another kind of door, the one that opens inward, silently, admitting a man not as guest, but as shadow. To learn these doors was an art. A novice might spend weeks in a city with no task but to walk its streets, counting entrances, measuring walls, watching patterns of servants. He would learn which doors swelled in damp air, which hinges groaned only when pushed outward, which locks could be lifted by prayer more than steel. Knowledge of entry was knowledge of survival. In palaces, the grand doors gleamed with brass, meant for spectacle. The brothers ignored them. They sought the smaller ones, the servants' entrances, the kitchen gates, the garden arches. A door that no lord noticed was the door most useful. Often, the brother would stand before it in daylight, disguised as beggar or pilgrim, committing every mark of it to memory. The scratches near the base, the way light fell on its edges at dusk. By night, the same door welcomed him as if it had always known him. But the deeper lesson was not wood or iron. It was timing. To open a door too soon was to walk into noise. To open it too late was to lose the moment. The brothers trained their senses for silence. The pause between laughter at a banquet, the moment when a guard sneezed, the instant when a bell tolled loud enough to mask a hinge. In these slivers of time, doors opened inward, and the world shifted. There were stories among them of doors that led not only into rooms, but into fates. One brother slipped into a scribe's chamber in Avignon and found a letter never meant for eyes outside Rome. Another entered the apartments of a bishop and discovered a chest of coins bound for rebellion. These doors did not merely open into stone, they opened into choices, into futures. The skill was not brute force. The brothers seldom broke locks. A shattered door left questions, and questions were enemies. Better to leave no trace, better to enter so gently that even the dust did not stir. Many brothers prided themselves not on the strike they delivered, but on the door they left untouched behind them, swinging softly as if moved by wind alone. The phrase "door that opens inward" became more than literal. It became symbol. A reminder that power does not always shout, does not always force its way through gates. True power waits, learns, and passes quietly when the moment arrives. To move inward is to move unseen. In time, the brothers could walk through cities as though every wall carried a hidden passage. They knew how to slip from alleys to kitchens, from kitchens to halls, from halls to chambers where whispers shaped kingdoms. No map held these paths. They were remembered in breath, in muscle, in instinct, and always the doors opened inward. For to force one outward would be to draw eyes, but to slip within, softly, silently, was to vanish into stone. Thus the brothers lived in a world of thresholds. Every mission began with a door, and every return ended with one. A door unmarked, unnoticed, yet heavy with meaning. For behind each one lay a moment when silence crossed into action, and the world outside never knew it. Beads in a hand can seem like nothing more than prayer. A pilgrim on a dusty road mutters through them. A widow in a chapel clutches them. A monk counts them as he paces. But for the brothers, a rosary was more than devotion. It was a tool, subtle and precise, a silent language of timing and measure. Each bead held weight not only in faith, but in rhythm. To pass one bead between fingers was to count a breath. 10 beads marked the time it took to cross a courtyard unnoticed. A full round might mean the span of a guard's patrol. The brothers learned this language until it was no longer counting but instinct. Their hands could move across beads in darkness as easily as eyes might follow a clock. The rosary also carried meaning. A brother could slip a bead forward during conversation, signalling readiness. He could drop one bead too early, a quiet warning to pause. In crowded chapels where words would betray, beads became the conversation no one else heard. To the outside eye, nothing unusual happened. Only prayer, always prayer. Some rosaries were altered for purpose. A bead slightly larger to mark a critical moment. a cross weighted differently to remind the hand of its place. Craftsmen who supplied these changes never asked why. They only knew the orders came with heavy seals and heavier purses. Stories tell of brothers who measured entire nights by beads alone. In Florence, one slipped past guards as the city bells tolled. He did not need to count their chimes. His rosary had already told him the time it took to pass from gate to hall, from hall to chamber, from chamber to task. When he emerged, the beads returned to his pocket, his prayers finished with perfect timing. The rosary also steadied the mind. Fingers on beads meant breath stayed even, thoughts stayed slow, fear stayed quiet. In moments when the body longed to tremble, the beads anchored it. Each one was like a stone on a riverbank, guiding water into silence. No one who saw them suspected. A priest prayed, a pilgrim counted, a monk meditated. Yet behind those same beads lay maps of timing, signs of warning, measures of action. The brothers did not separate prayer from purpose. Both required rhythm, both required trust, both demanded silence. And so the rosary became more than devotion. It became a metronome of shadows, a quiet companion that told a man when to wait, when to move, when to finish. Each bead polished by years of touch, carrying not only prayers, but the weight of actions that no book of hours would ever record. There is a ritual before every strike, a blade sharpened, then touched with oil, a letter written, then sealed with ink. The brothers knew that these substances, ordinary to most, were never ordinary to them. Oil and ink carried power, and both could mean life or silence. Oil was the first to be learned. A thin coat across steel kept rust away, but it did more than preserve. It quieted the blade. Metal that was dry sang when drawn. Metal with oil moved in silence, as though sliding through air itself. A brother would anoint his knife with the same care a priest anointed the sick. The act was both maintenance and blessing, for oil sanctified purpose. Without it, steel could betray. With it, steel became invisible. Sometimes oil was more than preparation. In apothecaries, vials passed hands without names. A certain mixture touched to lips could still a man before he finished a prayer. Another could leave him sleeping until morning bells. None of this was spoken openly, never confessed even in whispers. But oil was more than ritual. It was language written in liquid. Ink was the second. The church's world turned on parchment, and ink held its voice. Yet ink also hid truths. A letter might order a bishop to move, a monk to pray, a knight to serve. Between the lines, with strokes only the brothers recognized, lived another meaning. Certain curves, certain dots, certain ways a seal pressed wax. To others, it was text. To the brothers, it was command. Sometimes, the ink itself betrayed intent. A darker shade meant haste. A thinner stroke meant secrecy. A certain flourish at the end of a line meant urgency beyond words. Those who carried ink knew to read not the letters, but the weight of the hand that shaped them. The brothers often burned these letters after reading, but not always. Some were folded into missals, tucked into margins of psalters, hidden in prayer books where only certain eyes would look. The words might say nothing dangerous, but the ink told everything. And if the book fell into the wrong hands, no one would suspect. Oil and ink together formed a hidden liturgy. One prepared the tool, the other gave the order. One sanctified steel, the other sanctified silence. To outsiders, both seemed ordinary. Yet the brothers knew better. Without oil, a blade failed. Without ink, a mission lost meaning. Together, they carried the weight of shadows. In time, they became symbols, even among the brothers. Oil meant readiness, ink meant command. To receive both was to move. And when the task was done, the oil washed away, the ink burned, leaving nothing but silence. Robes and habits always spoke loudly in Christendom. A bishop's vestments glimmered with gold, a monk's habit whispered of poverty. A pilgrim's cloak declared his journey. But the brothers wore something else, garments of night, simple and shifting, designed to pass through every world without pause. Their clothing was never uniform. To look alike would be to invite eyes. Instead, they wore what belonged, what blended. In cities, they dressed as merchants, tunics plain but neat, hands stained with ink or flour. On roads, they carried cloaks worn thin, shoes dusted with travel, beads swinging as pilgrims. In monasteries, they could slip into brown robes and pass unnoticed among true monks. But beneath the surface lay the craft. A seam cut deeper so a blade could rest unseen. A fold stitched thicker so a vial could hide within. A hood drawn low to shade the face without appearing unnatural. These garments were made by tailors who never signed their work. Men and women paid in silence, their skill buried in shadow. The colours were chosen carefully, never too dark, never too bright. Black could draw suspicion as easily as gold. Instead, greys, browns, faded blues colours that disappeared in crowds. Colours that looked like walls, like dust, like dusk. A brother could walk through a marketplace at noon and vanish into the shade of a stall. At night, he became another shape among many. Even the fabric carried meaning. Wool for warmth in mountains, linen for ease in heat, blends that rustled less when movement required silence. Shoes soft-soled so steps whispered on stone. Gloves cut thin enough to feel steel, thick enough to leave no trace of touch. Every thread chosen for purpose, not for show. Yet vestments of night were not only disguise, they were discipline. To wear them was to step into role, to leave behind the self. A brother who pulled the hood forward knew he no longer walked as man but as silence. The garment became second skin, shaping thought as much as hiding form. There are tales of brothers who kept a cloak folded at the foot of their beds until death. They lived long after their tasks ended, yet they never parted with the fabric. It was not clothing, it was memory. A reminder that once they moved unseen, their lives measured not in names but in shadows. The church itself never acknowledged these garments. Officially, they did not exist. But some bishops, when they saw a figure in plain robe, seated quietly at the edge of a council, knew better. The presence said nothing, asked nothing, demanded nothing, and yet its silence spoke louder than sermons. Vestments of night did not shine. They did not draw attention. They did not linger in memory. But within their folds rested blades, messages, vows. And through their quiet movement, kingdoms shifted, crowns wavered, faith endured. For the brothers needed no armour of steel, no banners of silk. Their garment was shadow itself, stitched in silence, worn in obedience, and remembered only by stone. A chalice rests on the altar, as though it were only meant for wine. Silver or gold, polished to shine, lifted high during the Mass, so that every eye turns upward. But in the quiet work of the brothers, the chalice was more than a vessel. It became a test, a measure, a mirror. The chalice test was not about poison, though poison sometimes played its part. It was about truth. A man might speak with fervour, swear allegiance, bow his head, but the chalice revealed what his lips concealed. In councils and courts, a cup passed between hands could weigh loyalty more surely than 1,000 words. The test began in ritual. A chalice was set down between two men, filled with wine and blessed. Both were told to drink, to share in the same vessel as brothers in Christ. For most, it was ordinary. For some, it was unbearable. A man who hesitated, who lifted the cup with trembling, revealed more in that silence than any oath could. The brothers watched closely, not just whether a man drank, but how he held the cup, how his eyes shifted, how long he paused before touching his lips to the rim. They knew that fear lingers not in speech but in gesture. The chalice caught it all. Sometimes the chalice was weighted with more than wine. A trace of oil, harmless but bitter, enough to change the taste. Those who flinched betrayed themselves. Sometimes a mark was etched beneath the rim, a symbol only the brothers understood. If a man saw it and froze, he knew more than he should. That too was telling. The chalice test was never spoken of openly. Priests who saw it assumed it was a ritual of piety. Nobles thought it an old custom of brotherhood. Only the brothers knew its edge, sharper than any blade. There were stories of kings who failed. A ruler in the north drank from the chalice, but his hand shook so badly that wine spilled onto his robe. Within a month, he was deposed, not by armies, but by whispers that spread as quickly as spilled wine on cloth. The chalice also protected. It allowed the church to know who could be trusted, who might betray, who should never be left alone with secrets. In this way, it was shield as much as test. A simple cup, lifted with steady hand, could bind trust more deeply than parchment. The brothers carried this knowledge wherever they went. A chalice in a council hall, a cup in a tavern, a vessel in a bishop's house, all could serve as the same test. Wine was common, sharing was natural, but the eyes that watched saw deeper than anyone guessed. To outsiders, it was nothing. To the brothers, it was the oldest truth, that a man cannot hide his soul when it touches what is holy. The chalice was mirror, was measure, was judgment. And once the test was failed, the decision followed swiftly, silently, and without need for words. Every lock has a key, and every key has meaning. But in the hands of the brothers, keys were never only about doors. They were codes, signals, promises. A simple object of iron or bronze became a language of its own. The brothers carried keys not because they needed them, but because others believed in them. To be given a key was to be trusted. To return one was to signal completion. In monasteries, abbots handed keys to chosen men, for storerooms, for chapels, for libraries. But among the brothers, these keys often meant something else entirely. A large key might open no door at all, but serve as sign to act. A smaller one, worn on a cord, might signal delay. Keys exchanged in silence could carry entire instructions. To outsiders, it looked like simple duty. To the initiated, it was command. There were also keys hidden within keys. A hollow shaft holding a rolled slip of parchment, a notch filed slightly deeper than the rest, a mark that identified a meeting place. Sometimes, a key was nothing but symbol handed over as though it opened a chest, but in truth, it unlocked silence itself. One story tells of a brother in Avignon who carried a key larger than his palm. It seemed ordinary, a heavy thing for a heavy door. But within its shaft lay a message, written in tiny script. That key passed through 3 hands before reaching Rome, each man carrying it as though it were nothing but iron. When the message was finally removed, the fate of a bishop was sealed. The brothers knew that keys were powerful because they suggested trust. To hand someone a key was to admit vulnerability, to open the possibility of entry. And in that exchange, secrets flowed more easily than in confession. The church used this carefully. A noble might be given a key to a treasury, but what mattered was not the chest. It was the way his hand trembled when he accepted it. The locks themselves often mattered less. Many were false, chests designed to appear full, doors made to seem secure but leading nowhere. The true value lay in the exchange of the key. Who held it, who passed it, who pretended not to notice. This game of trust and silence built webs stronger than iron bars. There was also ritual. A brother might place a key on the altar before action, not to open a door, but to offer his will. As this key opens a lock, the prayer went, so let my hand open what must be done. It was symbolic, a gesture of surrender, yet it steadied them, turning doubt into clarity. Keys within keys, not metal alone, but message, not entry alone, but oath. In the hands of the brothers, a key opened not doors but decisions, and once given, it was seldom taken back. The Mass binds all men through bread and wine. The faithful kneel, receive the host, drink from the chalice, and believe they share in the same mystery. But for the brothers, These simple elements carried more than grace. They became signals, warnings, even judgments. Bread was the first. A host laid on the tongue was holy, but in the right hands it could speak. A brother might press a host slightly harder than usual, signalling caution. Another might place it with unusual slowness, marking danger. To the faithful, nothing seemed amiss. But to the one who knew, it was a message delivered without a word. Sometimes bread was marked subtly before Mass, a small cross carved deeper, a faint line visible only to careful eyes. Those who received it knew their path was not safe, that eyes were upon them. The host became more than symbol of Christ. It became shield, a warning disguised as sacrament. Wine carried its own language. A chalice passed with both hands meant urgency. Tilted slightly left meant delay. A sip withheld meant silence must be kept. In certain councils, brothers placed wine before men whose loyalty was in doubt. If the man drank too quickly, if his hand shook, if he refused altogether, the meaning was clear. There were darker uses as well. Bread mixed with bitter herbs, wine touched with powders. Rarely used, for such acts risked the soul of the one who prepared them. Yet, when employed, they left no doubt. A bishop who defied Rome might fall ill after communion. A noble who plotted rebellion might never rise from his pew. But most of the time, bread and wine were not tools of death. They were tools of silence. In monasteries, a brother might receive an extra piece of bread at supper, a sign to prepare. In cities, a cup of wine left untouched might mean an order had shifted. To anyone else, it was nothing. To those who served the seal, it was instruction. The Church itself encouraged this double meaning. The sacraments were never denied their holiness, but within holiness, space existed for necessity. A host can nourish the body and still carry warning. A chalice can hold Christ's blood and still signal silence. For the brothers, no contradiction lived there. God spoke in many languages, and sometimes one of them was secrecy. There is a story told quietly in Rome. A council convened to decide a matter of heresy. Debate raged until the hour grew late. At last, wine was brought in. Each cup was filled. Each man raised it to his lips. One man, a priest too bold in his challenge, found his cup empty. No explanation was given. He left the room, humiliated, and within a week he vanished. The wine had spoken more loudly than any sermon. Bread, wine, and warning, to the faithful, sacraments, to the brothers, signs etched into ritual. And in this way, faith and silence walked together. The body of Christ fed not only the soul, but the work of shadows. And in every Mass, behind every altar, whispers moved with the same weight as prayers. They did not march in ranks. They did not wear emblems, nor raise banners, nor swear allegiance before crowds. Their brotherhood was quieter than monastic orders, deeper than guilds, and more binding than family. To most eyes, they were nothing beggars at a gate, merchants in a square, pilgrims with dusty sandals. Yet they were connected, and the threads between them were woven so fine that few could ever see. The silent brothers existed without charter, without written rule. They were not proclaimed in papal bulls or listed in rolls. Their unity came from the oath spoken in shadows, from silence that became its own speech. Each brother lived apart, in cities, towns, monasteries, and courts. Many never met one another. Yet when the signal passed a candle flame left to burn too long, a letter sealed with unfamiliar wax, a rosary bead dropped in prayer, they moved as if guided by one hand. The silence bound them. It was not merely absence of speech, but the shaping of life around what must not be said. A brother who spoke too freely did not remain one for long. This was not punishment, at least not openly. It was simply that silence could not hold him. He returned to the world of words, while the others dissolved back into shadows. Those who endured learned to live in stillness. They could stand for hours in markets without drawing notice. They could move through feast halls with their faces blank as stone. gathering fragments of whispers and gestures, weaving them into truths others overlooked. A king might believe he commanded armies, yet his secrets passed unknowingly through the hands of a beggar leaning on a staff outside his hall. The brothers' training was not in swords, though some carried them, nor in poisons, though they knew their measures. It was in patience. A man who could hold silence until it became part of his breath could act without hesitation when the moment arrived. A merchant, accused falsely, cried out in his defense and lost all dignity. A silent brother, accused falsely, said nothing, and the silence itself unsettled the accuser until his lies frayed in the open. Their existence unsettled many who sensed it without proof. Bishops whispered of men who seemed to know too much. Nobles muttered of faces they saw in two places at once, yet no one could name them. No list recorded their names, no structure showed their hierarchy. To outsiders, they seemed like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to destroy. But among themselves, they recognized kin, not with words or signs too obvious, but with the stillness of presence. One brother entering a chapel at dusk could feel another already kneeling there, and no speech was needed. A nod, a glance, the shared rhythm of rosary beads. This was enough. They never prayed aloud together, never sang hymns in harmony, but their silence was a choir, and it carried across kingdoms. In this way, the silent brothers endured through centuries. Their unity was invisible, yet it held firm where armies failed. Their vows were unheard, yet they weighed heavier than treaties. No chronicle writes of them by name, yet their absence explains much. Rebellions that died before they bloomed, rulers who faltered without reason, letters that vanished without trace. The world remembers the noise of battles and councils, but the church remembers the silence that followed, and in that silence the brothers walked, unmarked, unknown, unseen. There are monasteries where the walls hum not with prayer but with secrets, places where chants at dawn are less important than whispers at night. These cloisters are not marked differently from others, stone arches, gardens, scriptoria, but their purpose is not copying psalms or tending vines. They exist to listen. The listener's cloister was no single place. It was any house that served the purpose of ears. Brothers stationed there lived as monks in the eyes of visitors. They tilled fields, they baked bread, they lit candles, but their true work was to attend, to gather, to remember. Every traveller who passed through became a source, a merchant resting for the night, a pilgrim seeking bread, a soldier boasting of campaigns, all spilled fragments of truth without knowing. The brothers never pressed too hard. They asked simple questions, offered warmth, shared a cup of wine. Men speak most freely when they believe no one is listening. And the cloister was built to appear deaf, harmless, safe, yet nothing was forgotten. A brother might hear of a new levy of soldiers, of a noble's discontent, of heresy whispered in towns. These fragments were noted, not on parchment, but in memory. Later, when a messenger arrived cloaked as pilgrim, the fragments passed from one silence to another, carried onward to Rome. The art of listening was not passive. It required training as much as wielding a blade. A true listener could distinguish between a lie told for pride and a truth told without care. He could hear the tremor in a soldier's voice when he spoke of loyalty, the pause in a merchant's tale that revealed more than words. To listen well was to see beyond masks. In these cloisters, speech itself was measured. Brothers seldom spoke above a murmur, seldom finished a sentence. They left space for the other to fill, space where truth slipped unguarded. A guest might believe he had guided the conversation, never knowing it was guided for him. Some cloisters specialized. A house near the coast listened for ships and tides, traders from distant lands. Another, near the Alps, gathered whispers of armies on the move. Another, in Rome itself, listened not to strangers, but to cardinals, confessors, servants. No one suspected. Monks were invisible, like walls around them, and walls hear everything. Occasionally, the listening turned dangerous. A guest might realize too late that his words carried weight. Suspicion might flare. Yet the cloister was always prepared. A guest who pressed too hard was given more wine, more warmth, more ease. If that failed, he left the cloister at dawn and did not return. Whether by chance or by silence, none ever traced the hand behind it. The listener's cloister did not fight wars or shape laws directly, but without it, many wars would have been lost before they began. Information moves armies, topples kings, protects thrones. And the church understood this. Where others prayed for knowledge, the cloister gathered it. Where others sought prophecy, the cloister built it from fragments of whispers. So it was that monasteries became more than sanctuaries. They were ears pressed against the world, cloisters that hummed with secrets carried in on the sandals of pilgrims and the cloaks of travellers. And, though the stones were silent, they remembered everything. The art of silence is not only in the mouth, it is in the body, how it moves, how it rests, how it passes through space. The brothers learned this truth early, for their survival depended not on strength of arms, but on mastery of stillness. Hands came first. A hand that trembles betrays the heart. A hand that fidgets betrays thought. A brother was taught to rest his hands always with purpose, folded as in prayer, clasped behind the back, steady on a table, never restless, never uncertain. The world notices more than it knows. A hand that shakes when lifting bread or wine tells more than words ever could. Training involved hours of holding positions. A novice might kneel with hands clasped until pain burned in his joints, until the body cried out to move. Only when the urge faded did he learn control. To master the hand was to master the will. Footfall followed. A step too loud, too quick, too heavy drew attention. A step too soft seemed unnatural. The brothers studied balance until they could walk in rhythm with surroundings, blending their stride with the clatter of hooves, the murmur of prayers, the ringing of bells. Their movement became music hidden within larger sounds. Some could cross courtyards without stirring dust, pass through chambers without creaking boards. It was not sorcery. It was attention, learning where wood bent, where stone cracked, where shadows fell. Each footstep chosen, not random, but part of a pattern as deliberate as liturgy. The discipline of footfall went deeper than movement. It taught patience, a man who waits for the right step, who pauses until a bell tolls, who halts until wind rises. Such a man controls not only his body, but his world. The brothers did not rush. They moved only when the world itself masked them, and so they seemed to vanish, not because they were invisible, but because they moved with the rhythm of things already unseen. The lessons extended beyond tasks. A brother who mastered hands and footfall carried silence into daily life. At a table, he reached for bread without haste, poured wine without spilling. In crowds, he slipped between bodies without brushing. Even in prayer, he knelt and rose with grace, as though time itself bent to his rhythm. This training was harsh. Novices often failed, breaking boards with careless steps, spilling cups with unsteady hands. But failure was corrected not with anger, but with repetition. Again and again, until hand no longer shook, until step no longer faltered. What seemed impossible became second nature. The church valued this discipline because it meant control. A man who commanded his body commanded his soul, and a man who commanded both could carry silence farther than words, deeper than prayers. There are tales of brothers who entered chambers filled with guards and left unnoticed, not because they hid, but because no one thought to see them. Their hands moved with certainty, their steps with purpose, their presence so controlled that they dissolved into the rhythm of the room. To master hands and footfall was to vanish in plain sight, and in vanishing, the brothers became more powerful than any army. For what cannot be seen cannot be stopped, and what cannot be stopped cannot be named. The world remembers loud men, generals, kings, priests, who shouted from pulpits. But it was the quiet men, the ones whose hands did not tremble and whose steps did not echo, who shaped what followed. And their silence still lingers, not in words, but in the echo of footsteps that never were. Every city wears a mask of walls, doors, and gates, but the brothers never looked first at how to enter. They studied how to leave. For entry is chance, but exit is survival. A man can always find a way in through deception, disguise, or shadow. But if the way out is not known, if the moment comes when silence must dissolve into speed, then all craft dies in vain. Thus they learned the discipline of exits. The training began in monasteries. A novice would be told to enter a cloister at dawn and remain until dusk, unseen, unheard. Yet the true task was not within the walls, but without them. At the end of the day, he would be commanded to leave, not through the gate he entered, not through the chapel doors, but through a path he had marked silently in his mind. The test was whether he had observed while others prayed. Had he noticed a loose stone in the wall? Had he seen a servant's door left open for deliveries? Had he watched how the shadows fell across the cloister garden? The lesson was clear. To step in without knowing how to step out is not skill but folly. The map of exits was never drawn with ink. No parchment held it. It was etched in memory, recalled in bone and breath. A brother entering a palace might spend hours at feasts, his face still as stone, yet his eyes flickered to every arch, every stair, every tapestry that concealed a door. He noted where smoke escaped, where draught stirred a flame, where servants slipped in and out with trays. In his silence, he carried more maps than any cartographer, but they were maps of survival, not of land. There are tales of entire cities remembered this way. Rome itself, with its alleys and cloisters, its aqueducts and bridges, lived inside the minds of the brothers as a network of exits. They could pass from the Vatican to the Tiber unseen, knowing which doors opened inward, which walls crumbled under pressure, which roofs joined from one house to the next. To them, the city was not monuments but pathways, and in those pathways lay power. The discipline extended to fire. To learn how a place burns is to learn its weakness. Brothers were taught to imagine flame, to trace in their minds where it would catch first, where it would leap, where it would choke air. A hall that seemed secure in daylight became a trap once smoke filled it. A brother who studied exits knew already where air would flow, where rafters would fall, where stone would crack. Thus even chaos became part of the map. The map was also in sound. The toll of bells, the shouts of guards, the barking of dogs, all were markers. A brother listened not for what was said, but for where it came from. He could chart exits by noise alone, knowing which streets lived in silence at midnight, which courtyards were alive with laughter, which windows never opened even in summer. In their discipline, exits were not escape but mastery. To leave without trace was to erase the act itself. A man slain in a chamber might be discovered, but if no door bore sign of entry, no gate bore witness of exit, suspicion fell elsewhere. Silence extended beyond the deed into the disappearance. Those who failed at this discipline seldom survived. There are whispered tales of novices caught because they lingered too long, because they believed the way out would show itself. None were told directly, but all learned the lesson. The exit must be known before the entrance is taken. To step forward without that knowledge was to court death. Thus the brothers carried maps unseen, worlds within their minds, where every wall had weakness, every door had moment, every street had silence. They lived not as men wandering, but as men who always knew the way back into shadow. And in that knowledge they held not only their survival, but the endurance of the silence they served. Confession was the heart of faith, the place where the sinner's burden met mercy. In dim chapels, voices poured through lattice and veil, spilling secrets too heavy to hold alone. But for the brothers, confession was different. Their deeds could never be spoken. Not to priest, not to friend, not even to themselves in prayer. And so they built another kind of confession, one without words, The ritual began with stillness. A brother would enter a chapel alone after the candles had burned low and the pews stood empty. He would kneel not at the confessional, but before the altar. No priest sat waiting, no ear bent to hear his voice. Only the silence remained. He did not speak aloud. He breathed. He let the weight of his actions settle on his body. The confession was in the bearing of it, not the naming. Some carried objects with them. A knife laid at the altar rail, not to be lifted again until the soul was steadied. A rosary bead separated from its cord, placed in shadow as a sign of fracture. These tokens spoke where voices could not. The silence read them as surely as words. The Church, in its wisdom, sometimes allowed such practices quietly. Confessors knew not to press certain men to receive their silence as offering. A brother might kneel before a priest, lips unmoving, while the priest whispered prayers of absolution over him. Nothing was spoken, yet everything was understood. The mercy was not in detail, but in presence. This kind of confession shaped them. To live without words was to live with burdens carried differently. They did not name guilt, so it never left them, but they did not drown in it either. Instead, they transformed it into vigilance. Each unspoken sin became a reminder to act with more precision, more care, more silence. Their guilt did not cripple them, it sharpened them. Among the brothers themselves, confession without words became language. Two men meeting in a chapel might never speak, but their presence side by side said enough. One might bow his head lower, linger longer in silence, his posture confessing what his tongue could not. The other would place a hand lightly on the pew, a gesture of absolution. No words passed, yet forgiveness was exchanged. There were darker moments. A brother who could not bear the silence sometimes broke, his actions growing reckless, his presence strained. Such men often disappeared, not by punishment, but by release. The silence reclaimed them. Some say they were sent on tasks from which they did not return. Others believe they walked into rivers, fields, forests, confessing finally to the earth itself. But most endured. They grew used to silence, as companion, as priest, as confessor. Their prayers became confessions, their stillness became penance, their breath became absolution. No word ever named what they had done, yet they carried on, sharpened by the weight, sustained by the silence. In the end, their lives themselves became confession. Each act of service was penance for another act unseen. Each silent prayer was both offering and apology. They needed no words. The silence was enough. And in that silence, they remained bound, forgiven not by priests, but by the Church's need for what they carried. Not all orders could be spoken. Not all commands could bear the weight of daylight ink. Yet silence alone was not enough, and so the brothers perfected another form of language, the night letter. A night letter was not a letter in the usual sense. It might be a scrap of parchment with no words, only a mark pressed faintly in wax. It might be a psalm written in careful hand, with certain letters darkened slightly, carrying hidden meaning. Sometimes it was nothing more than a fold of cloth, knotted in a particular way. To those outside, these objects meant nothing. To those within, they spoke more clearly than entire treatises. The art of night letters was concealment. A message had to move from one hand to another without drawing eyes. A true night letter could pass through markets, courts, even palaces, and none would ever suspect. The brother receiving it needed only to glance once, and the command was clear. They were carried in prayer books, tucked between pages of saints' lives. They were sewn into hems of robes, slipped into the hollow of keys, hidden beneath the wax seals of ordinary letters. The trick was never to conceal them too heavily. A hidden message draws suspicion if its hiding place is too clever. Better to let it lie openly where no one thinks to look. The language of these letters shifted constantly. Today, a cross drawn slightly askew meant urgency. Tomorrow, the same mark might mean delay. Codes were never kept long. To survive, they lived only briefly, then changed, then vanished. The brothers themselves often burned the letters after reading, scattering ash into holy water, erasing all trace. There is a tale of one such letter delivered in Florence. A merchant found a slip of parchment folded among his accounts. It bore only the image of a fish, crudely drawn. He thought it a jest, discarded it. That night, the man he was meant to meet never arrived. Days later, he learned the man had been found lifeless by the river. The fish had spoken to the brother, who saw it. To the merchant, it was meaningless. The night letters carried no names. They never ordered kill or spare. They spoke in images, in numbers, in psalms. Psalm 27 might mean wait. Psalm 51 might mean strike. A circle meant one thing today, another tomorrow. Only the silence bound them together. To write such a letter required discipline. Ink must not falter, mark must not betray. A careless line could doom a brother. Many trained for years, learning how to craft symbols that passed as ordinary, how to write in hands that resembled dozens of scribes. The goal was never beauty, but invisibility. The danger of night letters was great. If one fell into wrong hands, questions would rise. The brothers knew this, and so letters were treated as breath, living only briefly, then gone. A brother might carry one folded in his sleeve across half a continent, then burn it at the first candle he saw. No letter was meant to outlive the night it served. Yet, in those brief lives, they carried the weight of kingdoms. They ended wars before they began, silenced men before they spoke, moved shadows across Europe, all in silence, all with marks too faint to notice, too brief to remember. Thus the brothers spoke without speaking, wrote without words, commanded without commands. Night letters were the breath of the silence, passing unseen, vanishing like smoke, yet leaving behind a trail of deeds that shaped history itself. Tables laid with gold plates, goblets shining, bread steaming, wine flowing banquets were the theatre of power. Kings believed their feasts unassailable, proof of abundance and security. Yet no place was more fragile, for where men eat and laugh, they let their guard fall. And into these halls of light and music, the brothers sometimes moved like shadows beneath the tablecloth. The king's supper was not merely a meal, but an opportunity. Courtiers crowded close, guards softened with drink, servants bustled unnoticed. Eyes followed the king, the queen, the favoured noble. Few noticed the pilgrim who had served at the monastery that morning, now refilling goblets. Fewer noticed the quiet merchant seated far down the table, listening more than speaking. The brothers knew the supper was more than celebration. It was a map of allegiances, a stage of gestures, and within it, a silence could shift the balance of power more swiftly than armies. The art began long before the meal. A brother studied, who sat where, who received what portion, who was served first. To sit too near the king was trust. To be shifted further down was warning. Even the bread carried meaning, thick slices for allies, thinner for those whose favour waned. The brothers' eyes read these details like scripture, every movement a verse. When the time came, silence entered, not through violence, but through stillness. A goblet filled a little too high, a plate delayed, a word of blessing whispered too close. The king laughed, raised his hand, forgot to notice who passed behind him. A servant bowed, replaced a dish, lingered a breath too long. The supper continued. The music played. Yet within that pause, the fate of a man could turn. Some nights ended quietly. A noble left early, pale, clutching his stomach, his absence noted but not questioned. Some nights ended loudly, a guest collapsing among laughter. But the brother's hand was already gone. The shadow already vanished into kitchens and corridors. No one remembered the servant's face. No one thought twice of the pilgrim at the far end of the table. The king's supper taught the brothers patience. They could wait hours, even days, for the moment when noise covered silence. A toast shouted, a harp struck, a roar of laughter, all veils beneath which silence could act. They learned to let the feast itself hide them. Wine poured too freely masked trembling hands. Candle smoke rising thick disguised movements by the wall. The danger was always exposure. Too many eyes, too much light. Yet feasts proved safer than shadows, for no one looked for silence where noise was strongest. A blade drawn in an alley drew suspicion. A blade hidden by laughter went unseen. Thus the supper became the stage where silence thrived. Kings believed themselves guarded by gold and light, but the brothers knew gold reflects and light blinds. The louder the feast, the deeper the shadow. And in that shadow, the brothers moved, unmarked, unseen, yet present in the laughter of kings who never knew how close silence sat at their table. When words failed the church, doors began to close. At first, with sermons and decrees. Later, with locks and walls. And sometimes, with silence that moved through the heretic's door. Heretics believed themselves brave standing against doctrine, speaking aloud what others whispered. They held meetings in cellars, in barns, in hidden chambers lit by oil lamps. They barred their doors, swore loyalty, read words forbidden. They thought walls could protect them. Yet the brothers knew that every door opens inward if one has the patience to wait. The heretic's door was not always forced. It was watched. A brother would sit in shadow near the meeting place, silent, counting the steps of those who entered. He memorized their faces, their gestures, their hesitations. He learned which nights the door opened, which voices murmured, which prayers twisted scripture. He rarely acted at once. Silence thrives on patience. When the moment came, the door did not resist. Sometimes it creaked open, as if by its own weariness. Sometimes a servant left it unlatched. Sometimes the heretic himself invited the shadow inside, never knowing. The brothers stepped through not with fury, but with calm, for the church's survival was not in anger, but in certainty. Inside, the room fell quiet. Lamps flickered, pages of parchment lay open, voices stilled. The heretics knew what the door meant when it opened. Debate ended. Judgment began. The methods varied. Some brothers removed only one man, the leader, letting the rest scatter like leaves. Others ended the meeting entirely, erasing the voices before they spread further. Always, silence followed. Where words had challenged Rome, only absence remained. The heretic's door became a lesson in inevitability. No matter how strong the conviction, no matter how loud the words, the door reminded them, silence waits, walls cannot hold it, locks cannot bar it. And when the door opens inward, all voices cease. The church did not celebrate these acts. No hymns praised them, no records named them. Yet their absence spoke. Regions once filled with dissent grew quiet. Sermons, once interrupted by questions, flowed without pause, and the faithful believed truth had triumphed, never knowing silence had entered through the heretic's door. Venice, Florence, Rome cities, where power dressed itself in beauty, marble palaces, gilded halls, piazzas filled with masks and music. But beneath the laughter and festivals, silence walked as surely as shadow. The brothers called these places cities of masks, not because of carnival alone, but because every face was hidden, every truth disguised. In such cities, the brothers learned to wear masks of their own. Not painted porcelain or gilded feathers, but masks of posture, of tone, of silence. One day, they were merchants with purses heavy, the next beggars with bowls empty, the next pilgrims with dust on their sandals. Each mask fit the city, each face dissolved into the crowd. The city itself taught them. In Venice, canals carried whispers as surely as gondolas. A word spoken in one house travelled across water, carried into another by echo. In Florence, guilds layered secrecy within trade, cloaking power in contracts and coins. In Rome, every mask was layered with devotion, piety hiding ambition. To survive in these cities, one needed silence as mask. The brothers observed festivals closely. Masks made men bold. Behind feathers and jewels, nobles whispered desires they would never dare without disguise. Lovers met, rivals bargained, heretics plotted. And among them, the brothers walked, their own masks plain, their silence sharper than daggers. But masks were not only worn by others. The brothers used them to signal. A tilt of the head at a masquerade, a feather dyed black among white, a mask painted too simply, all messages passed unnoticed among the riot of colour. No one questioned a mask in a city of masks. Yet the greatest mask was silence itself. To speak too much risked betrayal. To remain quiet allowed others to reveal themselves. A brother in the crowd could stand all night, saying nothing, yet leave with truths enough to change kingdoms. For in masks, men feel safe, and in that safety, they uncover themselves. The city of masks revealed a deeper lesson. All men wear disguises, even without carnival. Kings hide fear behind crowns. Priests hide ambition behind robes. Merchants hide greed behind charity. And the brothers learned to read the mask until the truth beneath was clear. No blade was always needed. Sometimes silence alone was enough. A whisper placed at the right time, a mask left behind, a glance unreturned. The city shifted, power turned, heresy waned. No one knew why, but the brothers knew, for they had walked among masks, unmasked what was hidden and left without trace. The city remembers the colours, the laughter, the songs, but the silence remembers the masks and how they fell when no one watched. And it is the silence, not the song, that endures. The world believes power flows in straight lines, king to noble, noble to knight, priest to peasant. But the brothers knew it moved in shapes, in circles and triangles, patterns that repeated across courts and councils like the geometry etched in cathedral stone. To understand these patterns was to hold power without being seen. They learned early that no man ruled alone. A king leaned on councillors, a bishop on priests, a merchant on guilds. Influence spread not in lines but in webs, each strand pulling on another. The brothers mapped these webs with the same care a mason measured arches. They traced who spoke before the king, whose letters reached the pope, whose coin passed unseen. Every connection was a point, every loyalty a line, every betrayal a broken angle. In time, they spoke of circles. A circle was a group bound together by family, by faith, by secrecy. To break the circle, one need not strike all within it. One needed only to remove a single point, and the shape collapsed. Thus, silence often struck not at the strongest, but at the hidden weakest, whose absence unbalanced the rest. Triangles were stronger. In every court, 3 men held sway. One who spoke boldly, one who listened carefully, one who carried whispers. Strike the wrong one, and power grew sharper. Strike the right one, and the triangle shattered. A brother who mastered triangles could change kingdoms with a single silence. Squares were rarer, but dangerous. When 4 men bound together, king, general, bishop, banker, the square held firm. To unmake it required patience. A brother might spend years weakening one side, sowing doubt, eroding trust. Only when the angle faltered did silence move. The geometry extended beyond men into cities. Streets formed lines of trade, markets formed circles of exchange, councils formed triangles of influence. A brother could walk a city as though walking a diagram, seeing not walls but shapes of power. He knew where to press, where to cut, where to vanish. Some whispered that the brothers borrowed this knowledge from architects, those who built cathedrals with numbers and ratios. Just as arches stood by balance of forces, so did kingdoms. Remove one keystone, and all collapsed. The church had long understood that stone and power obeyed the same laws. The brothers applied them with silence instead of chisel. This discipline demanded patience. To study shapes meant watching for years, learning who leaned on whom, who held which angle. It was not the strike that mattered, but but the calculation before it. A novice who rushed risked striking the wrong point, strengthening the enemy instead of breaking him. Masters taught that silence must follow geometry. Only when the shape revealed itself fully could the hand move. Thus, the brothers saw power not as chaos, but as order. To others, courts seemed unpredictable, filled with tempers and chance. But the brothers read patterns as surely as stars. They knew the shape of betrayal before the words were spoken. They saw collapse in the angle of a council before it came. The world feared their silence because it seemed uncanny. How could rebellion fail before it began? How could alliances crumble overnight? But the brothers knew it was not magic. It was geometry. Power builds itself in shapes, and silence waits for the angle where one cut unravels all. In every town stood windows that saw more than walls. From kitchens, from lofts, from chambers above markets, eyes watched as soldiers marched, as priests preached, as merchants bargained. Many who looked saw nothing, but widows, especially, saw everything. Alone, silent, unnoticed, they leaned from windows and watched the world pass. The brothers learned early that these windows were as valuable as any cathedral vault. The widow's window was not a single place, but 1,000 across Europe. A small house in Florence, where an old woman spun wool while watching guildmasters argue. A room in Venice, where a widow sold bread, but kept her gaze on boats arriving. A loft in Rome, where a woman without family sat at dawn, noting who entered which door. They were not trained, not sworn, yet their silence made them allies. The brothers did not recruit them with promises. They gave respect, protection, sometimes bread, sometimes coin. More than that, they gave listening. Widows who lived unseen longed to be heard. And in telling what they saw, they found purpose. A brother who stopped at a window might hear not gossip, but detail. Which noble met which merchant? Which soldier lingered too long at which door? Which priest visited too often at night? The strength of the widow's window was its invisibility. Guards never questioned an old woman sweeping her stoop. Merchants ignored her eyes as they carried goods. Nobles passed without notice. Yet every detail entered her memory, and through her silence, into the hands of the brothers. The church itself often overlooked these women, yet in shadows their role grew vast. A heretic's meeting could be broken because a widow saw the same men gather each week. A plot against a bishop could be silenced because a widow noticed letters passed at dawn. Armies moved slower than widows' whispers. But the brothers also knew the danger. Widows lived without protection, and their knowledge made them targets. To keep them safe, the brothers never allowed them to know too much. They collected fragments only, enough to act but not enough to endanger. If suspicion fell, a brother stepped forward quietly repairing a door, fetching wood, paying debts to shield the widow's silence. Stories abound of widows who saved kingdoms. In Avignon, one watched from her window as a noble disguised himself to meet with rebels. Her detail, the colour of his cloak, the way he carried himself, allowed silence to act before the rebellion spread. In Venice, another noted which merchant ships arrived empty, though they claimed full cargo. Her words unmasked corruption that threatened to weaken the church's coffers. The widow's window reminded the brothers that power does not always sit in palaces. Sometimes it leans from a small sill, hands folded, eyes patient. Those who believed themselves unseen were always watched, not by armies, not by councils, but by silence that looked through windows when no one thought to look back. Thus the brothers cherished these unseen allies. Their silence wove with the brothers' silence, forming a web across streets and cities. And though the widows were seldom named, seldom remembered, their eyes became the church's own windows through which silence saw the world. Bells ruled the rhythm of Christendom. They marked dawn and dusk, mass and council, birth and death. A bell that tolled brought order, calling peasants to fields, monks to prayer, kings to audience. To live without bells was to live without time. And so, when a bell failed to toll, the absence was louder than thunder. The bell that did not toll was among the most subtle of the brothers' disciplines. It was not about striking a man or sealing a letter. It was about removing sound itself. To silence a bell meant to silence a city. The task required precision. Bells were heavy, their towers high. To still them, one needed not strength, but timing. A brother might climb by night, moving through beams and ropes, placing a wedge so the clapper struck nothing. Or he might sever a cord so the bell swung uselessly at dawn. No one noticed until the appointed hour came, and silence fell where sound should have ruled. The effect was immediate. Monks missed prayer, peasants missed labour, councils delayed, confusion spread. If the bell marked a heretic's trial, silence unsettled the crowd. If it marked a feast, silence spread unease. The people asked why God withheld sound. Fear grew faster than answers. But the bell could also protect. In times when the church sought to shield allies, a bell left untolled could delay soldiers, scatter mobs, cover escape. No one suspected the bell itself. They blamed storm, accident, ill omen. Yet always, silence had placed its hand upon the rope. There were legends of entire cities turned by a single bell that did not toll. In Siena, a council planned rebellion. The bell that should have called the meeting never rang. Men lingered in streets, waiting until guards arrived and scattered them. The rebellion died in silence before it spoke. In Rome, a noble's execution was to be marked by tolling. The bell never rang, and whispers spread that heaven itself spared him. His supporters fled, his enemies faltered, and the balance shifted overnight. To silence a bell was to speak in the loudest voice of all, not through words, not through steel, but through absence. The church understood this well. Hymns rose with bells, sermons began with bells, victories ended with bells. To take them away was to strike at the order of the world. The brothers who practiced this art carried no blade. They carried wedges, ropes, small tools of wood and iron, yet their silence thundered louder than armies. A bell that did not toll unsettled faith, unmoored time, and reminded all that sound itself served the church. The chronicles never mention these absences. They record only bells that rang, never those that fell silent. Yet silence remembers. For in every city where confusion spread, where rebellion faltered, where judgment vanished into uncertainty, there was always a tower where a bell hung still. And, in that stillness, the brothers' silence spoke most clearly, not in whispers, not in shadows, but in the echo of a sound that never came. Every chapel holds candles. They line altars, flicker in crypts, burn beside icons. To most, they are symbols of prayer, hope, remembrance. To the brothers, they were also signals and measures, their flames as sharp as steel. For the candle and the blade were bound together, one preparing the other, one hiding the other, one sanctifying what silence demanded. The discipline began with ritual. Before any act, a brother lit a candle, not for light, but for steadiness. The flame demanded patience. It rose, it wavered, it calmed. The brother's breath aligned with it. His hands stilled as wax softened. He waited until flame no longer shook, until his own body mirrored its quiet strength. Only then did he touch the blade. To strike without the flame was forbidden. The candle was reminder, act only when stillness is complete. But candles spoke as well. A single flame burning too long in a chapel might be warning. A candle snuffed abruptly meant danger had passed. Two candles lit in the wrong corner of a hall might call a brother to act. Few noticed these signs, for who questions candles in Christendom? They were everywhere, always burning. That was their strength. Their language lived in plain sight. The blade itself was never shown until needed, kept hidden in folds, wrapped in cloth, oiled to silence. Yet it was shaped by the candle. Brothers often sharpened blades by candlelight, not for necessity, but for focus. The glow revealed flaws unseen by sun, the shadows sharpened their patience. The knife honed under candle flame carried not only edge, but intent. There were stories of candles that saved lives. In Avignon, a brother entered a hall, prepared to strike, but a candle guttered, its flame bending wildly, though no wind touched it. He paused. Moments later, guards entered. Had he moved without that sign, silence would have ended in chains. The candle had spoken more clearly than words. There were also tales of candles that betrayed. In Florence, a brother left one burning in haste. At dawn, servants found wax pooled where it should not be. Questions rose. He vanished before they found answers, but the lesson endured. The candle must serve silence, not betray it. The pairing of candle and blade became more than ritual. It became symbol. One without the other was incomplete. A blade without candle was reckless, brutal, unmeasured. A candle without blade was wasted flame, devotion without purpose. Together they were balance, light and shadow, prayer and silence, steel and stillness. The Church itself never named this discipline, yet it benefited from it. Kings wondered why rebellions faltered, why enemies grew quiet, why words ceased before they spread. They never knew the answer lay in candles burned at midnight, blades drawn in silence. To live by the candle and the blade was to accept paradox, to strike while kneeling, to pray while sharpening steel, to balance sanctity and shadow. The brothers lived this paradox daily, their silence shaped by flame, their actions guided by steel, and through it they endured. Wine was blessing, wine was covenant, wine was blood of Christ. Yet, in the shadows, it could also be silence. The poisoned chalice was the most feared of all tools, not because of its cruelty, but because of its inevitability. For bread and blade could be refused, but wine, once lifted, was almost always taken. The brothers did not use it often. Poison carried danger greater than steel. Too much, and suspicion spread. Too little, and the act failed. Timing mattered, measure mattered, setting mattered. A chalice poisoned in haste could undo years of silence. Only the most disciplined dared it. They learned poisons as they learned prayers, by repetition, by patience, by trust. Some came from herbs steeped in darkness, others from powders ground in secret. Apothecaries who supplied them never spoke, never asked. They too understood silence. A brother learned to handle these substances as though handling relics, for one careless touch could end his own silence before its time. The chalice itself was chosen carefully. It had to be one the target trusted, one handed in ritual or routine. To offer it too boldly raised questions, to offer it too late risked refusal. The art was in blending inevitability with invisibility. A king raised his goblet, a noble toasted, a bishop blessed the cup, and within, silence waited. But the poisoned chalice was more than death. It was message. A man who collapsed after communion was judged by heaven, not by hands. A king who weakened after feast was said to be punished for pride, not for politics. The brothers understood this power, to turn silence into divine decree. Yet they feared it as well. To use poison was to place fate in uncertainty. Steel could be guided, but poison spread in ways unseen. Servants might taste, chalices might be swapped, hands might tremble. More than one brother ended his own silence by mistake, his lips touching what was never meant for him. These stories were told often, not to frighten, but to remind, poison is silence's most dangerous ally. Still, the chalice endured as symbol. It reminded all that trust itself could kill. To lift a cup was to surrender to what it carried. Kings who drank thought themselves invincible. Bishops who blessed thought themselves sanctified. Yet both could fall as easily as a peasant if silence willed it. The poisoned chalice became legend. Nobles whispered of it. Kings feared it. Priests prayed against it. Yet few ever saw it. For when it was used, it left no mark. Only silence remained. Every monastery was a house of prayer. Bells tolled, monks sang, candles burned. But some cloisters held more than hymns. Within their walls, silence was not only devotion, but weapon. The cloister of shadows was not one place, but many. Hidden within abbeys across Christendom, it was where the brothers were trained, shaped, and bound. These cloisters looked no different from others. Visitors saw monks bent over manuscripts, gardens tended, prayers chanted. Yet behind certain doors, another rhythm pulsed. Novices rose not only for matins, but for drills in silence. They learned to kneel without sound, to walk without echo, to breathe without tremor. Their prayers were lessons, their psalms rehearsals. The cloister taught not only stillness but endurance. Novices spent hours kneeling on stone, holding candles until wax burned their skin, carrying blades in sleeves until arms ached. Pain was not punishment. It was preparation. For silence is not gentle, it is weight. To carry it requires strength. Discipline extended to mind. A novice might be asked to sit in a chamber for days, hearing confessions of others without responding, watching men eat without joining, standing in council without moving. The task was not to act, but to endure absence. Only then could he act without hesitation when silence called. The cloisters also taught the language of symbols, candles placed in patterns, rosary beads shifted, letters written in psalms. Novices learned to see messages where others saw only ritual. To misread was to fail. To understand was to survive. But the cloister's greatest lesson was obedience. No brother left its walls without swearing oath, to serve the seal, to serve silence, to act without question. The oath was not shouted, not written. It was whispered in the ear of a novice as he knelt before the altar. From that moment, he belonged not to himself, but to silence. The outside world never knew which cloisters carried shadows. A pilgrim might rest in one, never realizing brothers moved behind its doors. A noble might donate land, never knowing he built a house of silence. The church itself rarely admitted their existence, yet it relied on them as surely as on cathedrals. The cloister of shadows was paradox, outwardly holy, inwardly hidden. Songs rose, prayers echoed, incense burned, but within, silence sharpened itself. The world believed monks lived only for God. Few knew some lived, also for the unseen hand that guarded his church with shadows. And so, generation by generation, the cloisters continued. Their walls grew old, their stones cracked, their bells rusted, yet the silence within endured. Brothers entered as men of flesh, left as men of shadows, and the world, never knowing, felt their hand in every rebellion quelled, every heresy silenced, every crown kept steady upon its throne. The roads of Christendom were always filled with travellers, merchants, monks, beggars, knights, and pilgrims. Of them all, pilgrims drew the least suspicion. A man in rough cloak, dust on his feet, a scallop shell pinned to his hat, no one questioned his presence. Pilgrims were everywhere, seeking shrines, relics, indulgences. To see one more on the road was to see nothing unusual. And so, the brothers learned early. When silence needed to move unseen, it walked as a pilgrim. The staff was their sign. To the unknowing, it was only a walking stick. To the brothers, it was tool, weapon, and signal. Hollowed staffs carried slips of parchment, narrow vials, even blades. Weighted staffs could strike when steel would draw suspicion. Notched staffs spoke messages. 1 cut for caution, 2 for readiness, 3 for action. The language of the staff passed between brothers without words, unnoticed by any who watched. But more than a tool, the staff was a mask. To lean on it made a man appear weary. To carry it made him appear poor. No guard feared the pilgrim, no noble saw threat in him. He passed through gates where knights would be stopped, sat at tables where merchants would be measured, entered chapels where others would be questioned. The pilgrim's staff was his passport, his disguise, his shield. There are tales of staffs that shaped history. In France, one carried by a brother was said to hold letters that silenced a noble family before they rebelled. In Spain, another staff concealed a blade that struck in a council hall, the sound lost beneath the hymns of pilgrims gathered outside. In Rome, a staff leaned unnoticed in a chapel corner, held secrets enough to topple a king. Each looked no different from hundreds of others, yet each carried silence within. Pilgrimage itself suited the brothers. Roads led everywhere, to towns, to castles, to shrines where all classes mingled. A brother could disappear for months, returning with dust and relics, and none would question his absence. He had been walking, praying, serving God. Only silence knew what his steps had also carried. The staff also taught patience. Miles of road passed beneath the pilgrims' feet. Villages came and went. Seasons turned. The brother who carried staff learned to wait, to endure, to blend into rhythm of journey. His silence deepened with every mile. By the time he reached his shrine, he was not only unseen by others, but almost unseen to himself. Yet, the pilgrim's staff was never abandoned. Even when tasks ended, brothers often kept theirs, leaning it in corners of chapels, carrying it into old age. For it was a reminder that power often hides in the most ordinary shapes, that silence moves best when dressed in dust, that faith and shadow walk the same road. Thus, the pilgrim's staff became one of silence's strongest allies. It drew no eyes, carried no suspicion, yet held within it weight enough to move kingdoms. The world saw only a traveller. Silence saw a brother. And the staff carried both burden and blade, prayer and purpose, until the road itself disappeared. Letters ruled kingdoms. Kings wrote decrees. Bishops sent orders. Merchants sealed contracts. Ink carried power farther than armies. But ink also betrayed. A letter left too long, read by wrong eyes, could undo years of silence. And so the brothers perfected a discipline that preserved their secrets, the letter that burned. At first, it was simple. Messages written in invisible ink, revealed only by flame or water. Parchments thin enough to crumble at touch, folded so they could be swallowed if danger came. But the brothers learned quickly that even the most clever trick could fail. A servant might discover the letter, a rival might preserve it, a guard might intercept it. The only safe letter was one that did not remain. Thus, every night, letters burned. A brother would read once, twice, memorizing every word, every mark. Then he would set flame to parchment, watch smoke rise, scatter ash into river or wind. The words vanished, but silence carried them still. Memory replaced ink, thought replaced parchment. A man who could carry orders in mind left no trace, no evidence, no betrayal. But the practice went further. Some letters were written only to be burned. They were prayers of obedience, oaths of loyalty, instructions too dangerous to linger. The act of burning was itself the obedience, the silence, the ritual. A brother might carry a sealed letter across half a continent, never open it, only to light it before a chapel door. Within that ash was command enough. He obeyed, though no words guided him. Legends tell of a single line written in such letters, "In silence, act, nothing more." The brother burned it, and his task began. How he knew what to do remains unspoken. Perhaps the order was already planted in his training. Perhaps the letter only awakened what was waiting. The world rarely understood. Nobles wondered why conspiracies crumbled. Kings wondered how secrets spread. Bishops wondered how silence always knew more. But the truth was simple. The letters that survived were distractions. The letters that burned carried the weight. To burn a letter was to accept burden. No man could prove what you had read. No ally could share your load. It was yours alone, carried in silence, executed in shadow. If you failed, no one would know why. If you succeeded, no one would know how. The flame erased not only ink, but witness. Even in age, brothers continued the ritual. Old men lit small scraps of parchment at night, though no words marked them, habit remained. The flame reminded them of vows, of silence, of memory stronger than paper. The candle burned, the parchment curled, the ash drifted, and with it silence endured. Thus, the letter that burned became more than practice. It became symbol of trust, of obedience, of secrecy that left no trace. The world kept archives, charters, records. Silence kept only ash, and in that ash lived truths more enduring than any scroll locked in Rome's vaults. Cathedrals rang with song, monks chanted, choirs filled stone vaults with voices rising like incense. The faithful believed these hymns untouchable, pure sound ascending to heaven. Yet the brothers knew that even in music, silence could hide. For among the choirs of Christendom, shadows sometimes sang. The shadow in the choir was not voice but presence. A brother might join monks for compline, his hood low, his chant blending. No one questioned an extra voice among dozens. No one counted faces in flickering candlelight. Within that sea of sound, he became invisible, but he was not there for prayer. His eyes scanned pews, noting who attended, who whispered, who lingered after. His ears caught words between verses, murmurs disguised by chant. His hands passed folded slips of parchment, tucked into hymnals or psalters, unnoticed by all who raised their voices. The choir itself served as shield. Voices masked footsteps, incense cloaked scents, robes blurred shapes. A brother could move from stall to stall, from altar to cloister, and none marked his passage. The chant drew all attention upward, leaving shadows below free to act. There are tales of entire plots undone in choirs. In Bologna, heretics planned to meet after Mass, certain no one suspected. But a brother stood among the singers, heard one whisper too low, saw one gesture too quick. By nightfall, the plan was silenced. In Cologne, a noble sought secret absolution from a priest. A brother knelt in the same choir, unseen, and carried word that ended his scheme. The shadow in the choir also offered safety. Brothers under suspicion could vanish into monasteries, their voices joining chants until pursuers gave up. Weeks later, they slipped away, unseen, unmarked. No one remembered the extra voice, for choirs were never counted. Yet, this discipline was not without danger. To join the choir required knowledge of chant, posture, ritual. A mistake, a note missed, a step wrong could betray presence. Novices trained for months, learning to blend perfectly. Silence in song demanded more discipline than silence in shadow. Still, the choir remained one of silence's greatest veils. In a world ruled by bells and hymns, no one imagined danger among voices praising God. And so, shadows stood among singers, their silence carried by music, their presence hidden by faith. The faithful remember choirs as echoes of heaven. The brothers remember them as sanctuaries of shadow, where silence moved with sound, where blades hid beneath hymns, where whispers carried as powerfully as psalms. For the shadow in the choir was not only man but discipline, to hide where none thought to look, to speak without words, to act without sight. And when the last note faded, when the candles guttered, when the faithful left, the silence remained. It had been there all along, singing among them, waiting, watching. The choir's voices reached heaven, but the shadow's silence shaped earth. The church lived by seals. Wax pressed with rings, with arms, with marks of bishops and kings. To see a seal was to see authority itself, proof that words within carried weight. But the brothers knew seals could be stronger when they vanished, when the only proof left behind was ash. Thus arose the seal of ashes, a discipline that turned authority into silence. When letters came from Rome, most bore wax red or gold. But some were different. They bore no mark at all, or bore one so faint that only fire revealed it. A brother receiving such a letter knew it was never to be preserved. He read once, burned twice, scattered thrice. The seal was not in wax, but in what remained when the parchment was gone. A handful of grey ash spread upon earth or water. That was the sign the order had been fulfilled. Ash carried meaning. To leave it on a windowsill was to say, "It is done." To scatter it across an altar was to say, "The task failed." To let it drift on wind was to say, "No word shall be spoken." Ash itself became language, one that passed unnoticed by all but those who served silence. The seal of ashes was not only ritual but necessity, for in times of danger, to hold a letter was death. Guards searched, nobles spied, rivals intercepted. A man caught with ink could not deny what it said, but a man with ash in his hand held nothing anyone could use against him. Silence survived where words did not. There are tales of entire councils moved by ashes. In Siena, a brother burned a letter meant for rebels, scattering ash into river. When their messenger arrived, no proof remained. Their cause collapsed, their voices silenced. In Rome, a bishop received only ashes on his desk. He wept, knowing it meant his ally was gone. The message required no words. The discipline also shaped the brothers themselves. To burn what one had carried across mountains and rivers demanded humility. They did not cling to parchment, did not treasure seals, did not preserve their deeds. They gave them to fire, to smoke, to silence. The church kept chronicles, kings kept archives, merchants kept ledgers. The brothers kept only ash. Even in death, the seal of ashes followed them. Some brothers asked for no tomb, no stone, no name. Only that their bodies be burned, their bones crushed, their dust scattered. They became their own seal, their silence, their only legacy. No relic, no record, no memory, only ash, marking that they had lived and served. The world fears fire for what it destroys. The brothers revered it for what it preserved. Not parchment, not ink, but silence itself. The seal of ashes was proof not of words written but of words erased, of commands obeyed without record, of shadows that left no trace but smoke carried by wind. And so, centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, yet nothing remained in archives of these acts. Only silence endures, and the faint memory of ashes that once spoke louder than any seal of gold. Every cathedral had its library, every monastery its scriptorium. Shelves lined with parchment, chained books heavy with knowledge. Men believed truth lived in words, bound in covers, guarded by locks. But the brothers knew another library, one never written, never chained, never seen. It was the library of shadows, where memory itself replaced parchment. The library began not in stone halls, but in men's minds. Each brother carried fragments of knowledge, routes across mountains, names of heretics, marks of nobles, signs of rebellion. Together they formed shelves unseen, volumes unwritten, wisdom passed not by ink but by breath. To write was to risk discovery. To remember was to preserve without trace. Training began with scripture. A novice learned to hold entire psalms in memory, reciting word for word. Then he learned codes hidden within certain words replaced, certain numbers counted. From there, he built new texts in his mind, whole chronicles spoken once, then erased from parchment forever. Memory became his scribe, silence his binding. The library of shadows stretched across Europe. One brother in Florence held knowledge of trade. Another in Paris carried names of guilds. Another in Rome remembered whispers of councils. None knew the whole, but together they formed an unseen archive. Messages passed without paper, secrets lived in silence. No king could burn this library, no thief could steal it, no enemy could read it. There are tales of this library shaping history. In Avignon, a rebellion was undone because one brother remembered every meeting place, every face, though no letter existed. In Venice, trade shifted because a brother carried numbers of ships and cargo in his mind, never written, never shared, except in whispers. In Rome, whole heresies died because a single man remembered names across decades. The discipline required more than memory, it required stillness. A mind cluttered with fear could not hold detail. A mind too proud could not carry silence. Brothers trained by fasting, by prayer, by hours of still thought, they learned to store memory as monks store relics, in chambers of the soul untouched by time. Some say the library of shadows grew so vast that it became legend. That one brother could recite centuries of secrets, another carried maps of whole continents in thought alone. Perhaps it was true, perhaps it was myth, yet the world feared it, for it meant silence always knew more than it revealed. Unlike other libraries, this one left no ruin, no ash, no relic. When a brother died, his shelf vanished. Unless he had whispered it into another's ear, the knowledge died with him. This was risk and strength alike, for what lived only in silence could be lost, but also it could never be stolen. The Library of Shadows endures not in buildings, not in archives, but in the memory of silence itself. Every word withheld, every truth remembered, every detail carried but not written, adds another book to shelves no eye will ever see. And in those shelves, kingdoms were shaped, heresies destroyed, crowns preserved, all without a single page. Every order has vows. Monks swear chastity, knights swear fealty, kings swear coronation oaths. Words spoken aloud, recorded, remembered. But the brothers swore differently. Their oath was never written, never proclaimed. It was whispered once into the ear of silence, and it bound stronger than any vow of parchment or crown. The whispered oath began in cloisters. A novice knelt before altar at night, candles low, walls echoing with prayers. He was not asked to speak loudly. He was asked to lean forward, to whisper. His lips moved, barely sound escaping. The words mattered less than the act, to pledge not in noise, but in silence, not in proclamation, but in secrecy. The oath was simple: obedience to silence, loyalty to church, erasure of self. But whispered, it became something deeper. For a shout can be broken, denied, forgotten. A whisper lingers. It seeps into bone, into breath, into thought. The brother who whispered could never unhear himself. His silence became his master. Few witnessed the oath. Perhaps a single elder stood beside, listening not with ear but with presence. Perhaps no one at all, only the walls of the chapel. The absence of witness made it stronger. A vow sworn before men could be denied. A vow sworn before silence itself could never be escaped. The oath bound not only action but life. A brother who took it ceased to be his own. His name faded, his past erased. He belonged not to family, not to guild, not to kingdom, only to silence. Even if he lived decades, even if he aged and left tasks behind, the oath held. Death alone released him. There are tales of men who tried to break it. A brother who spoke too freely, who sought to reveal what should not be revealed. Yet his own whisper returned to him in dreams, in conscience, in dread. He could not escape it. His whisper betrayed him, pulling him back to silence until he vanished from the world. None who swore the oath ever truly left it. The whispered oath carried weight beyond words. It shaped how the brothers lived. They spoke less, moved slower, listened deeper. Their vow was not shouted, and so their lives were not loud. They became the very silence they served. The church rarely acknowledged the oath. It could not. To admit it was to admit the existence of men who lived beyond record. Yet the church relied on it as surely as on sacraments. For vows whispered in shadows protected vows proclaimed in sunlight. The whispered oath remains mystery. No one knows exact words, no one knows exact right. Only that once spoken, it never dies. Perhaps some still whisper it today, in chapels no one enters, before altars no one lights. Perhaps silence still listens, still binds, still shapes, for whispers never vanish. They linger in stone, in shadow, in memory. And the oath whispered once continues to echo, binding not only those who spoke it, but the silence itself. And that silence, stronger than crowns, deeper than scripture, more enduring than steel, still rules unseen. Cities loved spectacle. Processions filled streets with banners, relics, trumpets and hymns. People lined alleys to glimpse saints' bones, kings' crowns, popes' blessings. Yet among these rivers of colour and sound, there sometimes moved another procession, one without banners, without trumpets, without songs. The silent procession was as invisible as it was inevitable. It was not declared. It was not marked on calendars. It flowed when it needed to, summoned only by silence. Brothers stepped into streets, not in robes or armour, but in ordinary garb, pilgrims, merchants, beggars. They walked not in step, but their presence formed a path. One passed, then another, each face unseen, each body blending. To the crowd, it was nothing more than life's flow. To those who knew, it was silence gathering. The silent procession served many purposes. Sometimes it was escort. A man marked for silence could not walk safely alone. So brothers filled the street, surrounding him though he never noticed. One behind him, two ahead, one across the road. If danger came, the procession closed like a net. If action was required, the noise of market masked the deed. When it was over, the man was gone, yet the procession flowed on, unchanged. Other times, it was signal. A bishop looked out his window and saw too many men moving with the same pace, the same patience. He knew then, silence had decided. No words came, no threats were spoken. The mere sight of the procession told him his choices were limited. Many bent their wills without a single blade drawn. It also protected relics, letters, and secrets. When Rome wished something carried across hostile streets, it was not guarded by knights in armour, it was carried within the silent procession. Brothers melted into crowds, forming walls of flesh that looked like nothing at all. Thieves never struck, enemies never saw target. The object arrived without mark, without trace. There were tales of entire uprisings quelled by such processions. In Florence, heretics planned to march in defiance, but on the day the streets filled first with silence. Dozens walked in different clothes, yet all moving as one. The rebels faltered, their courage drained, their steps slowed. They never gathered, never shouted. They melted back into alleys. Silence had processed before them, and no man wished to test it. The discipline of the silent procession demanded restraint. Brothers had to move without recognition, without rhythm too perfect, without glance too direct. They became shadows of the crowd itself, each part of a whole, yet indistinguishable. They were taught to mirror, to echo, to flow. It was not parade, but tide. And like tide, it carried all before it, unseen, yet unstoppable. The faithful never knew when they brushed shoulders with such processions. Perhaps it happened in Rome, perhaps in Venice, perhaps in their own village. Perhaps they once walked alongside men who carried silence like a cloak, never knowing what weight moved beside them. The processions left no hymn, no banner, no relic, only quiet streets after, and the faint memory of having walked with shadows. Stone hears everything. Cathedrals drink prayers into their walls, cloisters echo chants long after voices stop, towers carry whispers across air. The brothers knew this better than most. They learned to let stone listen for them, to place themselves where walls carried sound, to let silence gather words no one meant them to hear. In monasteries, cloisters curved sound. A brother could kneel in one corner and hear confession in another. He need not move, need not be seen. The stone carried the words. In palaces, domes gathered voices, bouncing them to corners where listeners waited. A brother, leaning casually against a pillar, could hear a king's plan spoken 50 paces away. Stone was the greatest conspirator. It betrayed without ever moving. The stone that listens was not only about hearing, but about knowing where to hear. Brothers studied architecture as monks studied scripture. They memorized arches, vaults, buttresses. They knew how sound travelled in chapels, how footsteps echoed in halls, how whispers moved in chambers. To the untrained, walls seemed deaf. To the brothers, every stone was ear. Sometimes listening required patience. A brother might kneel in prayer for hours, lips unmoving, while above him nobles plotted. Servants thought him devout, guards thought him harmless. Yet every word entered him, carried by stone. When he rose, he carried not only prayers but secrets. Other times, stone was used to test loyalty. A chamber might be chosen because its walls carried sound into hidden alcove. A noble brought there would believe himself private, his words safe. Yet the brothers listened, waiting for truth. Many were undone not by blades, but by stone that gave their secrets away. Legends tell of cathedrals built with this in mind. Rome knew the brothers' need, and masons carved spaces where sound travelled in strange ways. In one hall, a whisper at altar could be heard behind choir stalls. In another, words spoken in corner gathered in tower above. Was it chance? Perhaps. Or perhaps stone itself was shaped to serve silence. The stone that listens required more than hearing. It required memory. A brother could not write what he heard. He carried it in thought, in silence, in prayer. Hours of whispers became maps in his mind. The wrong detail forgotten, the wrong word misheard failure followed. So they trained their ears as they trained their blades, sharpening them to hear not only words but tones, hesitations, fears. To the world, cathedrals seemed holy. To the brothers, they were also libraries of sound, each wall a page, each echo a verse. The faithful prayed, nobles plotted, kings commanded, merchants bargained, stone heard it all. And through the brothers, silence remembered. Fires burned in every city, hearths glowed in houses, braziers in markets, torches in castles. Smoke drifted always, rising into sky, curling through alleys. Most saw only haze. But the brothers learned to wear it as cloak. The cloak of smoke was not fabric but cover, a veil of confusion that let silence move unseen. It began in battlefields. Fires lit by armies filled the air with smoke. Soldiers coughed, stumbled, lost sight of one another, but the brothers walked through haze as if born in it. They moved where others could not, striking unseen, vanishing into grey. Smoke became ally, not enemy. In cities, the cloak grew subtler. A fire in market, a torch knocked over in tavern, a brazier upset in courtyard. Panic spread, eyes turned to flame, and in that moment silence acted. A letter stolen, a man taken, a blade drawn, all unseen beneath smoke. When haze cleared, nothing remained but confusion. The cloak of smoke was also ritual. Brothers lit small censers before tasks, incense thick, air clouded. It calmed them, hid their faces, softened their movements. In monasteries, clouds of incense rose during Mass, and within them brothers passed messages, gestures unseen by all but each other. Faithful saw devotion, silence saw cover. There are stories of entire missions shielded by smoke. In Rome, a rebellion's leaders gathered in hall. At midnight, fire caught tapestries, smoke spread. While all rushed to save treasures, a brother slipped in, removed scrolls, vanished before flames died. In Venice, fog rolled from water, thick as smoke, and within it, silence acted. The city blamed weather, the brothers knew better. But the cloak carried danger. Smoke kills as easily as it hides. Brothers trained to breathe through cloth, to move low, to find air where none seemed. They learned to endure choking, to walk where others fled. Only then could they master cloak instead of fall to it. The cloak of smoke became more than tactic. It became symbol that silence thrives not in light, not in dark, but in confusion. When men cannot see, cannot breathe, cannot think, silence rules. The world fears smoke for what it hides. The brothers revered it for what it revealed, their own power to move unseen. And so smoke lingered always near them, in battlefields, in markets, in chapels, in incense and fire. It cloaked their faces, veiled their blades, softened their deeds. When smoke cleared, the world returned to order, never knowing what silence had done within its haze. The cloak of smoke left no relic, no proof, no mark, only faint scent, faint memory, faint unease. Yet kingdoms shifted, heresies ended, crowns endured, all because silence walked within smoke, unseen, untouched, unremembered. Every palace, every monastery, every bishop's villa had its gardens. They were meant for beauty and prayer, places where nobles strolled in silks and monks whispered psalms among flowers. But gardens also carried silence, for among roses and vines the brothers planted not blossoms but thorns. The garden of thorns was not one place but a practice. A brother knew that beauty distracted. Men bent to smell roses, women traced patterns in hedge, kings admired fountains. In those moments of lowered guard, silence could strike. A shadow by a wall, a figure kneeling as gardener, a hand brushing too close, these carried more weight than armies at gate. Gardens also carried secrets. Lovers met beneath trellises, nobles bargained by fountains, heretics whispered in shade. They believed hedges shielded them, that walls muffled sound. But the brothers moved within as naturally as bees. Their cloaks blended with leaves, their steps softened on grass, their presence hidden beneath canopy. They listened as petals opened. Thorns concealed them. The thorns themselves became tools. Roses pricked fingers, hedges scratched arms, vines tangled steps. The brothers learned to turn these into weapons. A thorn coated with poison, brushed lightly against flesh, did more than blade. A hedge path narrowed at just the right place could slow a man until silence overtook him. Nature itself became ally. Stories tell of princes who died in gardens, their deaths called accident. A slip near fountain, a thorn prick that festered, a sudden collapse among roses. To the world, fate. To the brothers, silence fulfilled. But the garden of thorns was not only death, it was patience. Gardens grew slowly, season after season. A brother planted seeds of silence, as carefully as monks planted herbs. He watched, tended, waited. A plan might take months to bloom, years to bear fruit. Silence did not hurry. Like thorn, it endured. The church used gardens as symbols of paradise, order from chaos. The brothers used them as reminders. Even paradise holds thorns, and those who forget bleed. The garden of thorns was their lesson, their sanctuary, their weapon. Beauty hid silence, thorns enforced it. And in every rose that bloomed, silence waited, sharp, unseen. Merchants ruled as surely as kings. Their ships carried grain, their carts carried cloth, their coins built churches and crowned princes. Behind every throne lay a ledger, numbers as sharp as steel. The brothers learned early that to master silence, one must master the merchant's ledger. A ledger seemed harmless. Columns of numbers, lists of goods, names of buyers. Yet within them lay entire empires. A shipment delayed, a loan recalled, a debt forgiven. These could topple lords faster than battles. Brothers studied ledgers like scripture, tracing not only trade but power. They learned to see what others overlooked. A sudden shortage of salt in one town meant rebellion nearby. Too much grain stored meant army in preparation. A loan from a banker in Florence hinted at war funded by coin, not crown. The ledger told truths no spy could hear, no council could declare. The merchant's ledger also offered leverage. Many nobles borrowed, many bishops spent more than tithe. To hold their debts was to hold their silence. A brother might remind a duke that his name appeared in column too long. He might whisper of forgiveness or hint of ruin. Few resisted, for every sword could be dulled, but debt never slept. Some brothers became merchants themselves. Cloaks exchanged for ledgers, daggers for scales. They blended into markets, spoke of cloth, argued over spices, yet their true trade was silence. A loan offered to wrong man, a price lowered at wrong time, a partnership dissolved, these were cuts deeper than blade. Legends tell of kingdoms undone through numbers. In Venice, silence shifted trade routes, leaving rivals starved. In Rome, a banker who threatened Pope's authority vanished, his books emptied before him. In Paris, a brother's single entry in ledger ensured army never marched, for soldiers were never paid. But the ledger demanded more discipline than sword. Numbers required memory, precision, patience. A mistake meant ruin not only for enemy, but for silence itself. Brothers trained as scribes, as accountants, as bankers. They learned not only to strike, but to build, to weave webs of trade that bound kings tighter than chains. The merchant's ledger reminded them that power is not only blood spilled, but coin spent. That silence can be written in numbers, debts, balances. And that sometimes the greatest strike left no body, no blade, no blood, only empty coffers, closed shops, broken trade. Every church had an altar. Upon it candles burned, relics shone, chalices gleamed. It was centre of worship, where heaven touched earth. But there were altars where no light burned, where no candle was lit. These were not for prayer, they were for silence. The altar without light was hidden, never shown to faithful. It stood in crypts, in side chapels, in cloisters barred at night. It bore no cross, no relic, no cloth. Only bare stone, scarred by years, dark with shadow. Before it, the brothers gathered not to pray, but to bind themselves to silence. There, tasks were given. No parchment passed, no word written. Only gestures, whispers, glances. A brother knelt, received silence, rose, and left. The altar bore no witness but stone. The absence of light carried meaning. Candles represented life, hope, salvation. Their absence meant death, secrecy, shadow. A brother standing before altar without light understood. His task belonged not to world above, but to world below. He acted not for glory, not for memory, but for silence alone. Legends whisper of what was done at these altars. Names spoken once, then never again. Blades blessed not with water, but with absence. Oaths sworn in shadow, binding men tighter than chains. No song, no chant, no scripture, only silence. To kneel there was trial. Darkness pressed heavy, stone cold, air thick. Many faltered, many feared. For in absence of light, a man faces himself. No candle to comfort, no relic to shield. Only his own vow, only silence. The church never named these altars. They denied them, perhaps feared them, yet they relied on them. For the tasks begun there preserved Rome more surely than masses sung above. The faithful prayed in light, believing themselves protected. They never knew protection was born in shadow, before altars unlit. The altar without light reminded the brothers of truth, that faith and silence are not always the same. One feeds hope, the other enforces order. Both serve God, but in different ways. The world needs candles, but it also needs altars without them, and so they endured, hidden, unseen, unnamed. Altars where no flame rose, but where silence was kindled. Altars where shadows knelt, rose, and walked into world carrying tasks never spoken, never remembered, never recorded. Altars where silence prayed not with words, but with deeds.